O stranger from beyond the horizon, the rare white heron of the single flight, welcome to this outflung post of your empire. Queen of a mighty throne built on the affections of countless peoples, enter your domain. The flight of the rare white heron was a poetic phrase created by the Maoris when the Queen reached New Zealand. But the start of the tour was on a dark November night from London Airport. A large crowd had gathered at Heathrow to join the royal family in wishing Godspeed to the Queen and the Duke. The Stratocruiser Canopus stands ready on the tarmac to take off on the first stage of the royal journey. Soon, the final farewells will have been exchanged. From one of the windows of Canopus, the Queen waves. Aircraft begins to move. The royal tour has begun. It having been decided that Cinemascope was to make this vivid contribution to the story of the royal tour, our camera unit took ship by the eastward route via Suez and captured these glowing pictures of the canal en route. On the bridge of SS Malaya now, steaming down the Red Sea towards Aden, the British colony at the southern tip of Arabia. Here, as always, the bumboat men were very much in evidence. On again into the Indian Ocean. At Colombo, capital and port of Ceylon, ships of many nations ride at anchor. And so presently, aboard SS Malaya, Cinemascope came to the South Pacific. It was at Suva, capital of Fiji, that Cinemascope joined the route of the royal tour. Gothic, having sailed westward via the West Indies and Panama, lay at anchor in Suva harbour, surrounded by dozens of the picturesque craft which skim the waters of the 320 islands of this archipelago. Now a launch puts out from Gothic and Her Majesty sets foot on Fiji, our first glimpse of her in the southern hemisphere. The islanders' welcome followed their own tradition. Its first quaint embodiment was the 3-year-old daughter of a chief who, in presenting the bouquet, performed her part with perfect ritual. Step back, sit down, clap hands. That's the correct form in Fiji. It's another local custom to show respect by preserving silence. Cheering is not the outward sign of loyalty among the 300,000 Fijians. As the ornately dressed chiefs make obeisance to their queen, silent solemnity is the watchword. The token of obeisance is the offering of a whale's tooth. But now the silence of the occasion is broken, as with guttural accompaniment, a rare beverage called yang gona is prepared. When the brew is ready, it's offered to Her Majesty in a coconut shell. The Duke follows suit, honoring an old and revered Fijian custom. After the dance of the warriors, and how formidable it must have appeared to their enemies in days gone by, the Queen and the Duke were conducted on a tour of local schools. From the war dance to modern standards of education. No doubt the Queen and the Duke marvelled at the progress which less than a century of benevolent administration has wrought in Fiji. Smaller than Fiji, Tonga is a land of friendliness and godliness, for Tonga was an early stronghold of the missionaries. It is also the only kingdom in the Pacific, and its royal palace has all the atmosphere of a delightful country house. Tonga's tall Queen Salote, beloved of the British public, conducted her royal visitors to the scene of a great feast. Tropical fruits, roast sucking pig, chickens, crawfish and other delicacies are laid out in a vast and appetizing array, more than enough for 1,000 guests. And for those guests, it's convention for them to help themselves. Here, a Tongan version of the war dance was performed. You'll notice that women take part in the dance, its warlike origins having been tempered by the influence of the church. In fact, the dances of Tonga owe as much to the rhythm of nursery rhymes as they do to the pagan chants of Polynesia. Nowadays, Christianity is cherished in Tonga with a devotion which has itself become a tradition. The Queen and the Duke worshipped in the Wesleyan Church with a crowded congregation of Queen Salote's people. As they left with their smiling hostess and bade farewell to the minister, it was nearly the end of their brief stay in the land which Captain Cook in 1770 had named the Friendly Isles. Later, on the landing stage, wearing garlands of flowers, they said goodbye to the hospitable queen of this small community and to her son and Prime Minister, Prince Tonga. Then, with the warm sound of Tongan voices ringing in their ears, voices of Polynesian people singing an English hymn, they boarded their launch to go back to their ship and the tour of New Zealand, which lay ahead of them. Gothic had 2 days sailing between the Friendly Isles and the northern island of New Zealand. 1,200 miles away, the city and port of Auckland was preparing to give the Queen and the Duke their first experience of the Dominion's enthusiasm and loyalty. Auckland, the largest and most cosmopolitan city in New Zealand, possesses a splendid natural harbour. But alas, on December the 23rd, when Gothic approached, rain and mist shrouded its entrance and veiled the majestic scene. Rain marked, though it failed to mar, the reception of the royal visitors by the city's people. In fact, in its fervour, the crowd outside the town hall broke ranks when the Queen took her place on the dais. With Mr. Holland, the Prime Minister, beside her, Her Majesty then replied to the address of welcome.
Mr. Mayor, I thank you most sincerely for the address of welcome which you have presented to me on behalf of yourself and the councillors and citizens of Auckland, in association with the local authorities and residents living near your city. This is the first time that I have spoken to New Zealanders in their own homeland, and my first words must be to tell you how happy I am to be amongst you.
Christmas in New Zealand is very different from its time-honoured setting in the Northern Hemisphere, but the Yuletide season in Auckland is nonetheless festive. Along the harbour beaches, with Rangitoko Island in the background, holidaymakers bathed in the sunshine and engaged in their water sports. Afterwards, they ate Christmas dinner, picnic fashion, on the foreshore. At Government House, where the Queen and the Duke were staying, a special celebration was staged with carol singing, a Santa Claus, and gifts for Prince Charles and Princess Anne. Then the royal visitors attended Christmas service at St. Mary's Cathedral, walking in the procession behind the bishop and clergy. Passing on from Auckland, the royal party entered Maori country. One of their first calls was on King Koroki, a Maori chief who'd had a mild grievance against the New Zealand government. This tactful courtesy helped to heal a source of friction. It also gave the Queen and the Duke glimpses of a picturesque procession of Maori war canoes. And so to Rotorua. Here at Arawa Park, the biggest Maori reception of the tour took place. The Maori people yield to none in the fervour of their attachment to the throne. After the welcoming haka, the Queen delighted the Maoris by accepting and wearing a korowai, or ceremonial cloak of chieftainship. Attired in this, she delivered her speech, and to the further delight of the great gathering, ended with the famous Maori greeting.
Mr. Minister, representatives and chiefs of the Maori tribes of New Zealand, I am most grateful to you for the address which you have presented to me on behalf of the Maori people. My husband and I have been much inspired by the welcome we have been given here today, and we have been delighted and interested to see your age-old ceremonial and dances. I thank you again for your welcome. Kia ora kutu.
To haunting and lovely tunes, Maori women now performed their poi dances. During this performance, a small stranger seated herself at the Queen's feet and stayed there while the show went on. And what a show it was. Weirdly painted faces and curious grimaces are all part of these complimentary displays by the valiant Maori race. A race once diminishing in numbers, but happily now on the increase again. The Queen and the Duke took their departure amid scenes of tremendous enthusiasm as the Maori people thronged around them. They stayed in the district of Rotorua for some days. This magnificent thermal region is one of New Zealand's beauty spots. Famous hot springs shoot up from below the Earth's surface to provide an exuberant spectacle. Pohutu, the most impressive of them all, is sometimes temperamental, but she produced a glorious display for this important occasion. Almost as strange, though not so beautiful, are the mud pools with the eerie sound made by their bubbles as they burst. But the scenic wonders of the Rotorua district were not yet exhausted. The Queen and the Duke paid a visit to Paradise Valley, where great rainbow trout swim in the placid waters of a reserve. New Zealand's trout are famous. Its unpolluted streams provide some of the best fishing in the world. New Zealand, Wellington, is situated, like Auckland, in the North Island. Its whole population of 135,000 seems to have been present somewhere along the route to see the Queen and the Duke enter their city. One of the first actions of the royal travellers was to pay a visit to the Citizens' War Memorial. Her Majesty's most important official engagement was, of course, to open New Zealand's Parliament. The occasion was quite unique. Never before had the Sovereign of New Zealand come in person to inaugurate a session of the country's legislature. The Queen wore her coronation gown, that wonderful creation of regal dignity and the dressmaker's art. And as she turned to acknowledge the ovation before entering the building, her youthful radiance was really breathtaking. Another official occasion was the garden party at Government House. When the Queen came out with the Duke to join the guests, thousands were assembled to greet them on the lawns of the Governor-General's residence. Many had the honour of presentation, and indeed the atmosphere of a garden party at the Queen's own Buckingham Palace was very faithfully reproduced in Wellington. Some lovely country surrounds the capital, and a drive through the Rimutaka mountain range was the prelude to arrival at Trentham for the race meeting. Everything here, with one exception, was reminiscent. All the ingredients of Epsom or Newmarket were there, except the British bookmaker. The horses parade for the big race. The main event of the meeting, the Royal Wellington Cup, and I can tell you in confidence that the winner is going to be a horse called Golden Tan. After the finish, there was quite a crush to get into the paddock, known locally as the Birdcage. But the timetable for the tour was rigid. The Queen and the Duke had to abide by its rules and leave Wellington and the North Island. To reach the South Island, they took a Royal New Zealand Air Force Dakota. Aircraft, climbing swiftly, winged its way over the Cook Straits, which divide the two chief islands of the Dominion. The South Island contains the Southern Alps, a range whose magnificence captures the admiration of all visitors. It stretches the whole length of the island and has been the training ground for such great mountaineers as Sir Edmund Hillary, one of the conquerors of Everest. Through this range passes the railway from the western seaboard to Christchurch in the east. It runs through Canterbury province, the source of Canterbury lamb. The homes of Britain have good reason to know that New Zealand breeds fine sheep. The royal train carried the Queen and the Duke through scenery of great grandeur to Christchurch. This, the largest city in the South Island, cherishes its English atmosphere. Sentiments of loyalty are profound here, and another great ovation awaited the royal travellers as they drove through the streets. Trotting is one of the specialities of the Canterbury district, and the Queen and the Duke attended the trotting races at Addington, not far from Christchurch. Race procedure follows the same pattern as orthodox racing. The entries now parade for the Royal Metropolitan Cup. Just watch those horses speeding by with all that peculiar smooth and lively rhythm of the trotting. From Christchurch, the journey was again by train with intermittent halts, as here at Oamaru. Each time when they resumed their journey, the royal travellers stood on the observation platform, acknowledging the cheers till they were drawn out of sight. Now the royal train travelled down the eastern seaboard, past river and woodland as far as Dunedin. Everyone should know that Dunedin is the old name for Edinburgh. It is in fact the Edinburgh of New Zealand. And here, when the Queen and the Duke arrived, Scotland was very much in evidence. When they presently attended the Highland Games at Carisbrooke, it was just like Braemar or Dunoon. Aye, and the lasses were as bonny as an old Scotland itself. Yes, it was Scotland all the way for the last few days, and what more fitting climax to their wonderful tour of New Zealand. Gothic steamed westward across the Tasman Sea. Ahead lay Australia. Sydney, that great port and city, its famous bridge spanning the harbour, lay basking in the heat of a glorious summer morning, eager to greet the first reigning sovereign ever to set foot on Australian soil. This great metropolis of the southern hemisphere has grown to a population of 1 3/4 millions in a century and a half. The harbour is large enough to contain the entire fleets of Britain and the United States. Gothic arrived from New Zealand after 3 days' sailing. The royal barge, having left the liner, proceeded through a lane of over 500 yachts and launches. Waiting to greet Her Majesty were the Governor-General and the Prime Minister of Australia and the Governor and Premier of New South Wales. The Queen and the Duke stepped ashore at the very spot where Captain Phillip landed in 1788 to become the first Governor of New South Wales. The Queen replied to the city's address in these words.
Standing at last on Australian soil, on this spot that is the birthplace of the nation, I want to tell you all how happy I am to be amongst you and how much I look forward to my journey through Australia.
First impressions of Australia, Sydney had exerted itself with characteristic vitality to put on a tremendous show. The triumphal arches which spanned the chief streets of the city were certainly magnificent, but no more impressive than the framework of Sydney's enduring asset, the Harbour Bridge. Opened in 1932, the 1,650-foot span rises 440 feet above the water. Rich in the many natural beauties which it has to offer, Australia also possesses a series of really fine beaches. The Queen had no doubt been made aware of the fame of Bondi, where a surf carnival was to be held in her honour. It was a blazing hot day, and in the glare, the Queen was finally compelled to use her dark glasses. Then the surf racing. Boats, manned by crews from the different beaches, pulled out through the breakers. At a given point, they turned to come coasting in again. It was obviously a great thrill for the Queen and the Duke, who overstayed their appointed time at the carnival by 30 minutes. Then, somewhat reluctantly, the royal party left. The Blue Mountains provided spectacle of a different kind, glorious in its tranquility. The Queen and the Duke came to Katoomba, not far from Sydney, to survey the superb panorama from Echo Point. Those pinnacles are the famous Three Sisters, a landmark which has lent itself to the weaving of legendary stories. Canberra is situated in the Australian territory of southern New South Wales. In 1911, the federal government decided to build the capital of the new dominion here, midway between Sydney and Melbourne. Noble buildings have arisen on the virgin ground of Canberra, but they are merely the nucleus of the great city yet to come. As luck would have it, the weather turned unkind for the opening of the federal parliament. Rain caused some alteration in the arrangements, and Her Majesty, robed once more in her coronation dress, had to pass directly into the parliament building. Later, however, it was possible for the display by children to be given, and their formation of the Australian flag on the opposite hillside was followed by a march past of the Australian services.